All right, morning to everybody. Yeah, I got woke up pretty fucking early this morning. I had a friend I haven't talked to in a bit from Kiev, basically fucking call me and tell me it was all popping off. So I was like, I couldn't get back to sleep, and I've already seen the great fucking disinformation machine kind of get rumbling, where all the political streamers on Twitch all want to chime in with their hot takes for subs. Um, and again, like I've said for fucking months, don't know anything about European history, don't know anything about the Soviet Union other than they think the hammer and sickle is a cute piece of iconography. Can't find Ukraine on a map. Raking in the money while they tell Zoomers about it all. And then on top of that, Twitter's going to be a nightmare. Because I understand for a lot of Zoomers, a lot of younger people, this will be their first fucking rodeo with something like this. It'll be the first time they've really come across a conflict that kind of feels close to home. It might even be kind of partially sort of relevant to their interests. A lot of World War III anxiety, tensions for the first time for this generation. Obviously, if you're my age, we've had a couple of them. We've had a couple of that, when we came out of the Cold War. Obviously, generations before the Khrushchev, Kennedy missile crisis. So this will be strange, new, uncharted territory for a lot of the younger folk. But obviously, just question. I mean, you know this by now if you watch my stream. Watching a live feed of CNN and MSNBC isn't going to fucking help because it's all going to be warped through the prism of DNC thinking. So you've got that problem. Next, I'll just tell you some hard, cold truths about disseminating information around conflicts around the world. If you followed what happened in Syria and Aleppo, we got lied to all over the place in the West. What you're going to have to be really mindful of is Russia is incredibly sophisticated when it comes to the distribution of disinformation, which obviously is different to misinformation. It is misinformation with a specific purpose or goal. And you are going to see probably some deep fakes. You are going to see a sort of full court press from Russian state media to make it look like the Ukraine is capitulating and that Russian troops are moving in at a greater acceleration than what they are, and that this has been a strategic military operation, and we're already starting to see civilian casualties piled up. I can't show them here. I've already seen my first videos of dead children in the streets. So you've got to be very mindful about that. Any influencer or anyone posing as a journalist or anybody that is, going to say to you, this is what's happening in Russia, if they ever reference Russian Times as a source, that's immediately disqualifying. And then the other thing to be mindful of as well, because on the other side, obviously, there's a lot of anti-Putin sentiment, because yes, there is. And again, we're going to rewrite history. You're going to see a lot of how 4 years of Trump emboldened Putin. It's definitely not Biden's fault. We'll probably get into that this morning. What always happens in a war is there will always be a video of an atrocity or a massacre or bodies, civilian casualties, and it will be promoted as being current and relevant in a bid to generate sympathies. Now, look, I think we were all in agreement. Let's distill it down right to its, essence at the start of the stream. War is bad. This shouldn't be happening, right? Okay. But equally, misinformation isn't going to help anybody either. And the people in the middle, the citizenry of the world, are going to get fucking pushed and pulled all over the place if you just blindly and, unflinchingly accept these sources that are going to get distributed on the internet. Now, there's going to be like a real sort of tough thing to negotiate because, right, and I'll just say this obviously at the offset as well. I am by no means an expert in European history or geopolitics. Not my field, not the thing I have focused on down the years. I consider myself well-read, but my particular area of, if you want to call it expertise, as it pertains to geopolitics, is UK, US, foreign policy, predominantly as it relates to the Middle East, and obviously media and media coverage around said policies. And so obviously anything you hear today, make sure you double check it. Make sure you go out and do your own reading. Don't take anything for granted. There's going to be a lot of people talking and telling you what to think, and it's imperative you go out and formulate your own opinions and you access your information. I sort of spent the first hour this morning while I was awake trying to process what was going on, sort of drafting up a very rough timeline so I can give you the history of sort of how we get to this point. I just want to say this won't be the most popular thing to say, but obviously, right, it's not as easy as Putin man bad, right? Now, Putin is bad. He's a fucking piece of shit. He's an irredeemable cunt in my eyes for a variety of reasons. But there are aspects to this where I believe, at least based on my reading and my understanding, this sort of could have been avoided, even right up until this point. One of the last conversations I had with a Russian friend, we were talking about this, and they were adamant war was definitely happening, that Putin was hot to trot, they were going to invade, and it wasn't going to just stop, quickly. It wasn't just to make a point. And he would be willing to take anybody on, right? And I was like, no, I feel like this is just another way to get everyone around the table and delay Ukraine's NATO membership, right? Which is what, I genuinely believed was sort of the predicate for this. NATO has given them that special status with a view that they are going to become a permanent member of NATO. I kind of feel that was what it was about. And I honestly thought, right up until today, that what would end up happening is Putin and the world leaders, like the last time it was Germany and France, and it would be like, listen, okay, for a temporary ceasefire and an end to hostilities, we'll delay Ukraine's entry into NATO by another 5 years or something like that. That's what it felt like to me. It felt like this was macho, chest-out posturing from an aging, dictator, essentially. And so I never really thought we would see a boots-on-the-ground invasion. Obviously, here we are. Well, actually, let me start by just explaining. I can actually show you. I got this military. It's like a Russian military map, and there you can see these are the two regions where we've got the hostilities here, and this has been going on for a while. This isn't anything new. If any, all the Ukrainian and Russians in the chat know all about this. These hostilities. These two regions essentially declared themselves as separatist, and there was a number of hostilities and tensions in part of these regions, in Donetsk in particular. And so what happened was they said, we want to be back with Russia. We liked it better in the Soviet Union, essentially. What Putin did in a bid to basically precipitate the war without it making it look like it was just a straight, direct invasion was he said, we recognize those two breakaway factions as being fully independent. Russia recognizes them and will support them. And so what that then does is it gives carte blanche to those separatist groups to start fighting, and Russia can come in and say, hey, we're just supporting our guys. We're sending in a peacekeeping force. And so that's what's been going on. But further to that, we've had military strikes and bombardments because they want to take out Ukraine's air defense capability. And this has led to Kiev being shelled. You probably saw, because I know a lot of you are esports fans too, you probably saw Simple tweeting about this, saying Kiev's being shelled, and we've seen a number of videos of that. So as I said earlier, you sort of have to go back to November in 2013. There was this thing called Euromaidan, and what this was essentially was this was a series of protests in the Ukraine, which was basically the people wanted to have closer ties, essentially, with the European Union, with Europe, And this is ancient, this is medieval. I can't go into all of that. I won't go into all of the Ukrainian and Russian history. But essentially, when the Soviet Union dissolved and Ukraine broke away from them, there was a lot that went on at the start of that created some tensions kind of in the 90s, which actually include Ukraine ended up with a huge nuclear arsenal when they broke away from the Soviet Union, and Russia didn't like that, as you can imagine, and so they essentially cooked Ukraine into handing over all of their nuclear capability, in exchange for to be allowed, to sort of have their independence and do their thing. That was part of the agreement. Things were kind of getting better in the early noughties. There seemed to be a lot of positive moves made between Russia and the Ukraine. But then what ended up happening was you had an election where a chap called Yanukovych, he got elected, and he essentially was perceived to be a Putin puppet. He had very close ties to Russia. He was very friendly with all the Russian money oligarchs, and so he made a number of domestic decisions that were sort of more in line with what the Russian interests over what the people believed to be Ukrainian interests. On the tail end of it, you had this outbreak where it was like the Ukraine, a nation that sort of has increasingly become more, I hate this term, but, westernized, Eurocentric, pick one. There's differences in the language. They're obviously very different historically. They've got different views and different ideas about where they want to go. You had these Euromaidan protests, and the Euromaidan protests were basically large groups of people that went to the, key areas, including the central square in Kiev, and they barricaded it off, and they had protests. Funnily enough, Western leaders all around the world fully supported this barricade. I won't get into that. It's not the time. And so these protests ended up escalating, as you can imagine, because Yanukovych certainly didn't like it one bit. He was like, this fucking sucks. So in February of 2014, after 3 months, 4 months of solid protests and them shutting down key areas of the city, he decided he was going to issue a violent crackdown. And trust me, if you want to see some fucking old school police brutality, you go watch those videos. They're harrowing. It is rough. And, horrible scenes. But as a result of this, the protesters sort of came out on top. So, it basically, when the police went in to have a clampdown, the Ukrainian citizens didn't capitulate. The Revolution of Dignity occurs at the tail end of the Euromaidan protests, and the protesters win, and Yanukovych has to flee the country. He's got to go, because we're going to have a new government. It's been deemed Yanukovych, by quelling the free protests, is a traitor to Ukraine, and we're going to incarcerate him. We're going to fucking imprison him, and he will face a trial. So he says, fuck that. I'm not in for this. I'm out of the country. Peace. See you later. And so you end up with Yanukovych fleeing the country. And if there was any doubt as to where his true affiliations were, Putin helped Yanukovych get out of the country. Russia helped ousted Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych to flee from violent protests in February, according to Putin himself. It's the first time Putin gave details on how he helped his ally escape. Russian speakers in Ukraine's east mostly backed Mr. Yanukovych and were enraged at his overthrow, which helped to fuel months of violence. Ukraine is electing a new parliament this Sunday, but eastern separatists will hold their own vote next month. And so you can see that separatist group in the Donbas region, this hasn't helped at all. That only emboldened that group to fight back and get what they want, which is to be reabsorbed into Russia. And just also to show you how far this went, once that new government was convened, They quickly called the court. He was meant to attend. He didn't. Viktor Yanukovych was found guilty of treason, 5 years or whatever it was after the fact. They did get round to actually prosecuting him. If Viktor Yanukovych ever returns to Ukraine, his 13-year sentence for treason will begin immediately. So after that, there's a power vacuum because we have to have a new election. Poroshenko wins the 2014 elections that happened, but while they're gearing up to have those elections, Russia decides now is a good time to annex Crimea. And that's where you end up with, I'm sure many of you were around in 2014, that's where you end up with this sort of weird global situation. I've told anecdotes about it before. But, I couldn't travel. We were meant to do an event in Moscow. We didn't know how bad the tensions were going to go. But they basically decided to annex Crimea, which is kind of what a lot of people are talking about now. And the reason they just decided to do it was because without Yanukovych there, without a puppet, they didn't know what direction Ukraine was going to go. They didn't really have any insight into who might get elected next, but, Poroshenko was a front runner. And so they were like, right, now's the time. We'll go and do it, and we'll seize it, and we'll have a little bit of a land grab. One of the things that this led to in Europe was there was a lot of fear, and this is the other thing that's all wrapped up in all of this, because, right, Ukraine has a ton of fucking oil pipelines, right? Well, gas pipelines, I should say. These are all of the gas pipelines that run through the Ukraine. So obviously, you can see as well the Luhansk and Donetsk region, which is the parts controlled by Russian-backed separatists. That's where those military units were assembling on the border. You can see we've got a few pipelines running through there, but none of the major ones that run around here. But back in 2014, when Crimea was annexed, there was a lot of tensions about, well, what happens to our energy in Europe, right? The Europeans were getting very, very worried. There's a lot of newer members of the European Union that were adjacent to the Ukraine as well, that were worried there might be disruptions to their energy supply. There was all these tensions. Prices started to go up. Gas prices started to shoot through the roof. You probably felt it where you live without even realizing it if you were around in 2014. Suddenly, your gas bill, your electric bills, these were all shooting up amid these tensions where we didn't know what was going to happen because the pipelines that flow through Ukraine are absolutely essential to keep energy consistent across all of Europe. Once Russia had gone into the Ukraine, while that was going on and Europe were getting a little bit antsy about what it was going to do to their power supplies and their ability to provide gas consistently, those pro-Russian separatists that we've been talking about, they then said, what we need is a people's republic in Donetsk and Luhansk. They wanted to say, look, we've got Crimea now, Russian territories encroaching, we want the Ukrainian border to be redrawn, and we want our regions to be people's republics and given names and absorbed into Russia. And this is why, when I say that none of this is new, if you know anything about the region, you'll have already been familiar with this. The key difference now is just essentially open and broad Russian involvement. But this is where you end up with the war in Donbas, right? And the war in Donbas is where the Ukrainians said, look, enough's enough. We got fucking this shit kicking off in Crimea. We got these motherfuckers declaring themselves as people's republics. We got to go in and push back. And they did. There was a number of actual battles that yielded casualties to sort of quell a separatist uprising in the Ukraine. Meanwhile, by the way, you probably remember this, and this was the Malaysian Airlines flight. I don't know if you remember, but there was a passenger plane that was flying over the separatist airspace, and it got fucking blown out of the sky, and 298 people were killed. No one survived, right? And so, literally, a rocket was launched at a civilian passenger flight under the assumption it was some sort of military interference. And still to this day, by the way, no one's been held accountable for that. It's just like, whoopsie, my bad. So, anyway, so that happened. And then the next thing that occurred in the in these sort of escalating hostilities, because that especially was a big kind of like wake-up call, was they started to negotiate a ceasefire, and this was called the Minsk Protocol. They went to Minsk to negotiate this. And this is a crucial component to understand, because when I said there's a lot of nuance to this, and perhaps this could have all been avoided, this is one of the key aspects of it. They got all of the people around the table as it pertains to the Donbas region conflict, and they said, look, mate, this has all got to fucking stop. We got civilian fucking planes getting blown up. We got fucking deaths. It's going to cause major disruption to other interests like us. And you can see who better than Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel to act as mediators in this peace talk. That was what I was talking about earlier when I said Germany and France got them round the table. They were able to sort of come to this agreement. And basically what they wanted to have, and I'll read you the points of the Minsk Protocol, to ensure an immediate bilateral ceasefire, so, both parties stop shooting at each other, to ensure the monitoring and verification of the ceasefire by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is basically a security group that works in monitoring intergovernmental tensions on behalf of the United Nations. They wanted a decentralization of power through the adoption of Ukrainian law. So in other words, that separatist region has to start recognizing Ukrainian state laws. They want to have a permanent monitoring of the Ukrainian-Russian border, again verified by that security group for the UN, with the creation of what they call security zones. That was another thing. Immediate release of all hostages or illegally detained persons. People had taken a number of hostages in this. In fact, key to these negotiations were there were a number of combatants on both sides that were being held as prisoners of war, and part of the agreement was everyone's just got to go back home, immediately. They had to continue an inclusive national dialogue. So in other words, these talks were going to be ongoing, right? We're gonna keep negotiating and working through this. We have to improve the humanitarian situation in Donbas. Now, obviously, just as a kind of sidebar, if you want, the separatist regions had sort of experienced a lot of sanctions, I guess. But, they'd had stuff like their power had been interrupted, access to water was being interfered with. Obviously, there was, ongoing border tensions and hostilities. They wanted to have an improvement of the conditions for even the combatants on the Donbas side, because, the citizenry that just happened to live there, right? You have to understand there's citizens, on both sides of this that just don't give a fuck. They just want to get up and go to work, right? They want a better lot for those people. They want to ensure an early local election as well, withdraw any illegal armed groups, adopt a program of economic recovery and reconstruction in the Donbas region, because that's been negatively impacted by all of the attritional aspects of war, and to provide personal security for the participants in the consultation. In other words, they wanted to ensure that all the major figures were protected and there wasn't going to be any fuckery. Everyone agreed to that, and they all signed it. It all goes through. It's all looking good. But then by January, the ceasefire was essentially over. The separatists continued to fight. They took a major victory at Donetsk International Airport. And basically, their guy came out and said, listen, we're done with this now. Their side didn't acknowledge it. Our lot didn't improve. We're going to continue to fight. We're going to continue to do our things. And meanwhile, by the way, spoiler, guess who's funding all of their hostilities? It's Russia, of course. That has been a silent component of this war for fucking time, right? That Russia's been feeding guns and everything else to this separatist group. Now, by the way, just as if you want to universally condemn that is what America does all around the fucking world to overthrow democratic elected leaders that don't adhere to American imperialist foreign policy. Then in 2017, you get this. Poroshenko says, fuck all of this bullshit. NATO's the future. Now, just as I meant to explain this prior to this, because I'm sure there's some people watching who don't even know what NATO is. NATO, it stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a convergence of governments, but explicitly a military alliance. NATO protect their members by adding their military strength to them. They also will go into other non-NATO countries and act as peacekeepers, kind of like what the UN does, if requested. But anyway, so Ukraine want to come into, the fucking, into the fold, right? They've been increasingly cozying up with Europe. They've certainly got, all these tensions with Russia haven't helped the idea that they're going to heal relationships. They ousted the last guy, and 2 years from this point are going to find him, guilty of treason for being in league with Russia. So there's a lot of positivity around getting to join NATO. But the problem is, if they join NATO outright at this juncture, Russia are going to go fucking absolutely spare. They're livid. They don't want... Russia doesn't want Ukraine or Georgia or any of these countries that they have borders with in NATO. They see NATO as an existential kind of enemy because it represents another huge block of power and military power and wealth. So you can imagine, right? When Poroshenko comes out in 2017 and says, I want to basically get in NATO, they hold a vote in Parliament, the vote passes, we're going to join NATO, and then you have to fast forward to the next president, right? The application to join NATO is a long process, and it's put on hiatus. And NATO give Ukraine a special status. I think it's called Membership Plus. I'm not too sure, which, by the way, that sounds like a fucking Disney subscription, doesn't it? But it's called like Membership Plus or something like that. And it's where you're not a member, but you get lots of benefits from being NATO adjacent, let's say. Tensions sort of ease off a little bit. Not entirely. You've still got friction down in the Donbas region. You've still got separatist groups wanting to break away from the Ukraine. You've still got Russia funneling guns and supplies into those groups to prop them up. But, it's business as usual in the Ukraine, essentially, at that point. But then we end up having elections in, I think, 2019 is when Zelensky gets in. And this is another key accelerant in the conflict that we see today, because the NATO, it's the Enhanced Opportunity Partner Program, right? That was what it was. And Zelensky was absolutely adamant, like, NATO's the future, we're going to get into it, we have to be in it, it's in our interests, it doesn't matter what this does in terms of Russian tensions. And remember, Putin absolutely is adamant Ukraine cannot join NATO. He doesn't want that. NATO hold a summit, and they're discussing whether or not we're going to go back to an open door policy where we're just going to let anybody who wants to come into NATO come into NATO. Ukraine is indicating very strongly we're going to do it. Georgia are talking about coming in. And so as a result, obviously, this again inflames tensions between Russia and these countries, because this is the thing that can't be allowed to happen in Putin's mind. As a result of this, in March of 2021, the Kremlin decides, better watch what's going on with this, because Ukraine are definitely going to join NATO. And, I feel like people probably forgot about this, but this is last year. We had these stories. Supposedly, we were going to have an invasion back then. It just didn't blow up in the news. It just didn't become sort of the big news cycle. But Russia planning massive military offensive against Ukraine involving 175,000 troops, U.S. intelligence warns. There was meant to be, there was a meeting in June, and this was another reason why we get to here in December. This was the U.S.-Russian summit, as it was called. They met up, and one of the key topics of discussion at this juncture was, what are we going to do about this Ukrainian bullshit? Like, looks like they're going to join NATO, Vladimir. Like, can we fucking sort this out? And you can see, look, I'll read you this part, right? Prior to the summit, Biden and Putin had met once, and it was in 2011 in Moscow. And it was back when Biden was vice president and Putin was prime minister. After an official group meeting, Biden characterized in his memoir as argumentative. He and Putin then met privately. And Mr. Biden, this is the story that Biden told. Mr. Prime Minister, I'm looking into your eyes. right? I looked the man in the eye. I was able to get a sense of his soul. I don't think you have a soul. And then to which Putin replied, we understand each other, right? So another work of fiction from fucking Biden. But anyway, the bottom line is, all of this fucking nonsense that was built up around how Joe Biden, the elder statesman, the guy who knows how all the levers work in Washington, is gonna, and Putin absolutely fears him. Absolute nonsense. Complete work of whole cloth fiction. Biden has no special insight into Putin. They have no special relationship. He's met the fucker once, and then the only thing he's got to say about it was, I looked him in the eye and said he had no soul. So the idea that, like, you know, which is a lie, of course. So the idea that, like, Biden was the guy that was going to fix everything in this summit is hilarious to me. But anyway, days before the talks, Putin had denied responsibility for the cyber attacks on meat processing companies in the US. He said that the accusations were an attempt to provoke conflict ahead of the summit. Russian criminal gangs were accused of the ransomware attacks. Russia also has had long-standing concerns about plans to expand the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, meeting with NATO allies in Brussels 2 days before the summit. Biden refuted an assertion by Ukrainian President Zelensky that NATO had agreed to admit Ukraine to the alliance. Ukrainian allegiance has been a persistently contentious issue between Russia and the United States. By the eve of the summit, Biden stood by his decision to not participate in a post-summit joint press conference with Putin, following the advice of Russia experts to avoid any attempt by Putin to appear as though he had gotten the better of Biden. So the messaging around this summit is completely muddled. If you remember, it's from that clip where Biden has a fucking meltdown and pops off at one of the journalists. Because essentially, he came in, you know, and was piss weak. He was absolutely piss weak. He said, Russia, you definitely did all these cyber attacks on us. You hacked our elections, remember? And Vladimir Putin just goes, no, he didn't do any of that. It was Russian criminal organizations. Fuck you. Now let's talk about Ukraine. And Biden's like going, yeah, Zelensky's saying that they've been admitted to join, but I don't think that's true. And that was that. And then Biden just goes and has a fucking nap while Putin's like, okay, this cunt's weak as fuck. Putin is a savvy man. And so what he's correctly identified is Biden is piss weak and senile. And on top of that, he needs a crisis. So there is this kind of like implied understanding that if I go and do this and you get to be a strong leader, you know, to your people, we can all play a little fucking shell game where you get to look cool. So anyway, that brings us up to 2021. That was June in Geneva. So then, just before Christmas, when they deployed those troops to the border that I showed you in December, they wanted security guarantees from NATO, and they specifically asked NATO not to allow Ukraine to have membership. Russia said, look, we can stop all these tensions tomorrow. We just want to dictate who can and can't be in NATO. Just a small matter, right? And you can see the NATO chief, Jens Stoltenberg, he said, absolutely, fuck you, right? There's no way we're going to allow Russia to dictate who can and can't be in NATO. And this is a report on Al Jazeera from that time. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has rejected Russian demands to rescind a 2008 commitment, that's how long this has been going on for, to Ukraine, that the country would one day become a member of the Western Military Alliance. The remarks came on Friday after Russia's foreign ministry said that NATO should formally scrap a 2008 declaration to grant membership to Georgia and Ukraine, two former Soviet republics. NATO's relationship with Ukraine is going to be decided by the 30 NATO allies and Ukraine, and no one else, Stoltenberg told reporters in Brussels. And already told you about, on Thursday, US President Joe Biden talked to Zelensky days after he spoke with Vladimir Putin, and where the US president publicly urged the Russian leader to take the path of diplomacy to de-escalate the situation, or he would face harsh economic sanctions, which, by the way, I've heard Biden threaten Putin with economic sanctions repeatedly. I think you're going to have to play another card, mate. You know, I'm not an expert, but I think you are going to have to fucking say something else, because Putin came out today and basically said, you will face You will face a reaction to the sanctions, the like of which you've never felt before. And then, yep, essentially, the European Union came out, obviously separate to NATO, and said Russia would face consequences if it invaded Ukraine. Remember, this is December 2021. Germany's new chancellor called for talks, get around the table, resolve tensions in the wake of Moscow's military buildup. Aggression needs to come with a price tag, which is why we will communicate these points ahead of time to Russia, said the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen at a joint news conference. Ukraine accuses Russia of preparing for a possible large-scale military offensive, but the Kremlin denies planning any attack. Earlier in the day, during a visit to France, Scholz called for a revival of the Normandy format, talks between Germany, France, Russia and Ukraine to resolve the crisis. We're deeply concerned about the troops we're seeing on the Ukrainian border, and that's why it's important that Europe be firm in this area and show clearly that Europe's borders are inviolable. And so, obviously, we can now see, here we are in February 2022, none of that seems to have worked at all or deterred Putin. January 2022, we start having all these meetings between Western and Russian diplomats. That doesn't work. We're sending out people to be like, ease tensions. Early February, the US had a sense that maybe something was going on, and in a bid to deter them, they sent 3,000 US troops out to Poland, Germany, Romania, all obviously around Ukraine. And that was sort of meant to be a potential deterrent, a show that, listen, we will get involved. Then Russia and Belarus, they started maneuvering troops as well, because Belarus is a component of this. That brings us up to a couple of days ago, where basically Putin recognized the independence of the two separatist regions that precipitated this invasion that we've got this morning. So it took an hour to get there, but that's pretty much everything you need to know. I might have missed out some details. I've got some guy in the chat creating accounts spamming me saying I'm trying to mislead you. I'm definitely not trying to mislead you. I don't really have a dog in the fight beyond saying I think Putin's a piece of shit. I don't like authoritarians and tyrants, and I don't like war, and I don't like when sovereign nations are involved and civilians are killed. Now, just before we also get into it, I did mention this thing about white separatists, which Putin's bringing, white supremacists, sorry, in the separatist groups that Putin's bringing up. I want to just show you how this was independently reported in Reuters in 2018, completely divorced from this kind of conflict, because if you remember, things kind of ebbed down in the period between 2017 until Zelensky got in. And you have to understand, this is being resurrected now as part of the rhetoric, because you actually have, if you can sort of believe it, you've got tankies who are supporting Russia, because hammer and sickle good, and that's their understanding of geopolitics, and they're supporting it on this basis. They are saying Putin is a hero because he is overthrowing white supremacist organizations within the Ukraine. That's a literal take you will see on Twitter today. You will see that. Now, that, by the way, is absurd, but I want to just let you know that it was reported kind of independently. Reuters is independent a news organization as you're sort of going to kind of get these days, and you can see, look, as Ukraine's struggle against Russia and its proxies continues, Kiev must also contend with the growing problem behind the front lines. Far-right vigilantes were willing to use intimidation and even violence to advance their agendas, who often do so with tacit approval of law enforcement agencies. And this talks a lot about how you've got national militia groups rising up. And it talks specifically here when Russian President Vladimir Putin seized Crimea 4 years ago, and it exposed the decrepit condition of Ukraine's armed forces. Right-wing militias such as Azov and Right Sector stepped into the breach and fended off the Russian-backed separatists, while by the way, who also have their own white supremacist issues. There's, as I told you, there's some white supremacist groups down there who are upset they've had to fight fellow white supremacists. It's crazy. But anyway, these white supremacists fought off the Russian-backed separatists. And so as a result, that's led to a lot of people in the media inferring that actually the government is supporting these white supremacist groups pushing back Russia. I'll get to the Putin speech today. But you can see there was a video about it on NBC where they were showing, these military camps for these groups and everything else. So this was just reported in 2018. And unfortunately, one of the things that's ended up happening is you're going to sort of get kind of useful idiots that end up doing like heavy lifting for the Russian regime because of this focus on these people, these, this minority as being sort of tacitly approved of by the Ukrainian government. And Putin has, like I say, invoked this in his speech today. Peter Hitchens wrote this on the 19th. He said, "Granny gets her gun from a bunch of shameless neo-Nazis, not that the BBC would ever tell you." And this is an article talking about BBC coverage of the Ukrainian kind of resistance to the Russian invasion, and and how one of them had like an SS logo in the background, and sort of, like you can see here, one of the roots of the Russia-Ukraine problem is, alas, the existence of some very crude and nasty factions of Ukrainian nationalism, many of them unblushing neo-Nazis. Of course, there are plenty of perfectly civilized Ukrainian patriots, but bigoted racialist thugs have an influence way beyond their numbers in that country. This is why so many Russians living in the Ukraine have often felt excluded and have often yearned to be ruled instead from Russia. And that explains a lot of the things that are going on now. Now, unfortunately for me, and again, this is opinion, this is editorializing, I don't think this helps at all, because the inference there is that the separatists have a fucking point, because, and it's not like they don't have their own white supremacist groups in that region as well. There are some, fighting. And this is sort of justifying wanting to break away. This is justifying Russian support. Now, I will give Peter Hitchens some credit. He actually did come out today after the war was declared, after having wrote an article that could be viewed as essentially carrying water for the Putin regime, and did say Vladimir Putin turns out to be stark staring mad. Aggressive war is a crime and nothing excuses it. So fair enough. One of the great cardinal sins of Christopher Hitchens, in my opinion, who was a man that his intellect I admired, his writing I admired very much, as a polemicist, potentially unrivaled in his era, but he ended up being a useful idiot for the Bush administration and for the Blair administration in his insistence that the war in Iraq was completely justified because it toppled Saddam Hussein. At least his brother Peter sort of has repudiated this idea that you should, that actually it's okay that Russia invades because there's some nasty people in Ukraine. Let's also add some other background context as to why some people are speculating this is happening as of now. I talked about it earlier. There was this, and this is the Putin approval rating in the polls. Trust in Putin drops to its lowest level since 2012. A new opinion poll indicates that Russians' trust in Vladimir Putin has dropped to its lowest level in nearly a decade. The Levada Center survey, released on October 6, found 53% of respondents saying they trusted Putin, down from the 71% in September 2017. Levada said it was the lowest recorded level of trust for the Russian leader since October 2012, when 51% of respondents said they trusted the president. Trust in Putin soared in 2015, a year after Russia's annexation of the Ukraine's Crimea Peninsula, reaching nearly 80%. And so you can see immediately there's this ongoing thing in geopolitics where it's like people can't help themselves. After Crimea, he gets a bump in sort of the opinion polls. I don't know if that's likely this time. It feels a very different vibe. But again, I'm talking to mainly like liberal Russian friends of mine. I don't know what the average Russian person thinks or feels. But anyway, a lot of people have said, what a better way to get a bump in the polls and present Russia as a strong international force again at a crucial time to do so. Why not? Why not fucking go to Ukraine and push into these separatist regions? Why not? Especially while Ukraine keep publicly flexing that, yeah, we're going to join NATO. We're 100% in. We're definitely going to join. The other thing was there were some reports, and these have been mainly laughed off and bullshitted, and I certainly didn't believe them at the time. But there was rumors swirling around that Vladimir Putin was ill, terminally so, actually. These reports ranged from saying he had Parkinson's was one of the reports over there. Others saying that he'd had emergency surgery for cancer, was on his last legs. And this was in 2020, end of 2020. You can see here, the Kremlin on Friday rejected as untrue reports in Britain's mass market Sun newspaper. Now, obviously, if the Sun is not a go-to source for geopolitical insight, is it? No, this definitely not. But they interviewed a professor, a dissident called Valery Solovey, who said openly on Moscow radio that Putin was being pressurized internally by his cabinet to step down because his health was failing, and his health was failing on a number of reasons, one of which was he had early Parkinson's disease, and the other was that he'd been battling cancer and had emergency surgery to extend his life with the understanding he had a prognosis of a few years. The fact that only the Sun picked up the story kind of suggests to me that's absolutely fucking bogus, and I don't buy it. But again, you're probably going to see that get brought up, and that's going to be brought to the table as potential context for why this is happening now. I don't buy it. From my own reading, that guy Solovey, that he is a professor, but he's also like considered a fucking joke. So just some guy who just spits out conspiracy theories, sort of like an educated Alex Jones, I guess. So how does this war get declared? How does it happen? Well, first up, Putin has a very specific way of framing it, and this is crucial to sort of understanding where we're at. This was the speech I was telling you about from a couple of days ago, where basically he sat down. And after sort of posturing that there wasn't going to be an invasion.
Move is a major escalation in this crisis. First, he staged a televised.
This is where he says that we're going to recognise that those breakaway regions as actually being part of Russia.
Russia's National Security Council, where he made a show of considering appeals from his top aides on whether to recognise the two Russian-backed breakaway states in Ukraine as independent. Hours later, he made a televised address.
Look at the weapons of NATO. It would be possible for them to control Russia's airspace with medium and long-range missiles and ballistic weapons. They could attack sites throughout Russia in less than 30 minutes. I do not doubt they plan to attack, as they have in the past.
The self-declared republics of Donetsk and Luhansk are in a state of high alert after their leaders advised their people to evacuate and told them Ukraine is mounting an offensive. That's a claim Ukraine denies. But there's now a real risk that Russia's forces could roll into what Ukraine describes as temporarily occupied territory. That's because with formal recognition of independence, Russia could present itself as answering a request for help.
United States of America and other partners, and of course Ukraine, were for quite a long period of time were saying that to provoke the conflict, the false flag operations will be organized by Russia Federation. And this case is exactly the example of such a false flag operation.
Ukraine's foreign ministry says it's dealing with dozens of fake incidents and false flag operations. It says they're all intended to build up as excuses for potential war. And one of the byproducts is fear instilled into the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians living in the breakaway republics. The suffering may become so much worse for these people and millions of others. What was decided in the Kremlin on Monday could be one more step closer to war.
So that then leads us to the formal declaration that we had today. This was what Putin said about why the war was happening, moments sort of after it was declared. Vladimir Putin addressed Russians from a wood-panelled room in the Kremlin as he laid out his justifications for the start of a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, on this front, by the way, this recurring phrase of full-scale invasion, so far, the understanding of the conflict is that they want to take those separatist regions and expand the border. There's no, I don't know if they're going to go beyond that. Nobody knows if they are, but the media are already saying that is a given, right? So I'm a little bit skeptical about the term full-scale invasion, because full-scale invasion implies that Russia's plan is to take over the whole of the Ukraine and not just these two separatist regions that they've recognized as being independent. You know, it obviously doesn't justify it. I'm not for it. I don't want you to think that. But I am sort of against this American insistence, this media insistence that this is, Russia are going to completely take over Ukraine. Like, Ukraine won't exist after tomorrow. That's like a nonsensical conceptualization of what's going on, I feel. But anyway, Putin accused the West of turning Ukraine into a hostile anti-Russia country on our own historical territories, from which the US would use as a platform to attack Russia. He cited the right to self-defense as enshrined in Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. He then vowed to defend people who have been victims of the Kiev regime and demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. So that's where he's at. When he says denazify, he's talking about the shit I just showed you, which is those groups, those white nationalist groups that went and defended Crimea and went and fought the separatist regions. Tiny little groups, by no means official government operatives, by no means officially endorsed, but because it was all tacitly kind of approved of, because they were fighting to, maintain the Ukrainian status quo, essentially. That's what's being used by Russia as a talking point in the media. You can decide, I guess, how you feel about that. Those were extracts from Putin's speech. Obviously, Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, made his own. I'll read it to you. I have initiated a call today with the President of the Russian Federation. The result, silence, although the silence should be in the Donbas region. That is why today I want to come with an appeal to all citizens of Russia. Not as president, I am appealing to the people of Russia as a citizen of the Ukraine. We share more than 2,000 kilometers of border. Around it today is your army, almost 200,000 soldiers, thousands of military units. Your leadership has approved their movement towards us, towards the territory of another country. This step can become the start of a big war on the European continent. The whole world is talking about what can happen any day now. A reason can appear at any moment, any provocation, any spark, a spark that has the potential to burn everything down. You are told that this flame will bring freedom to the people of Ukraine, but the people of Ukraine are free. They remember their past and are building their own future. They are building it, not destroying it, as you are told every day on television. Ukraine in your news and Ukraine in reality are two completely different countries. The most important difference is that ours is real. You are being told that we are Nazis. But how can a nation be called Nazis after sacrificing more than 8 million lives to eradicate Nazism? How can I be a Nazi when my grandfather has survived the whole war as part of the Soviet infantry and has died a colonel in an independent Ukraine? You are told that we hate Russian culture, but how can a culture be hated? Any culture. Neighbours are always enriching each other culturally, yet that does not make them one entity and does not separate people into us and them. We are different, but that is not a reason to be enemies. We want to build our own history peacefully, calmly, and truthfully. You are told that I am ordering to attack the Donbas region, to shoot, to bomb without question. Although there are questions, to shoot at whom? To bomb what? Donetsk, to which I have been dozens of times. I have seen the people's faces and eyes. Artemis Street, on which I have been on many walks with my friends in the past. The Donbas Arena, where I have been rooting with the locals for our own team during the Euros. Sherbakova Park, in which we were drinking together after our team lost. Lugansk, the home of my best friend's mother, the place where my best friend's father is buried. Note that I am now speaking to you in Russian, yet no one in Russia understands what these names, streets, and events mean. This is all foreign to you, unknown. This is our land. This is our history. What are you going to fight for and against whom? Many of you have visited Ukraine in the past. Many of you have relatives here. Some of you studied in our universities and befriended Ukrainian people. You're familiar with our character, with our people, our principles. You know what we cherish the most. Look inside yourself. Listen to that voice of reason, of common sense, and hear our voices too. The people of Ukraine want peace. Ukrainian authorities want peace. We want it and we will make it. We do everything in our power to do so. We are not alone, it's true. Ukraine is supported by many countries. Why? Because we are not talking about peace at any cost. We are talking about peace and about principles and about justice, about everyone's right to define their own future of safety and everyone's right to live without threat. All this is important to us. All this is important for peace. I know for sure that this is also important to you. We know for sure we don't want war, neither cold, hot, or a hybrid of the two. But if we are threatened, if someone is trying to take away our country, our freedom, our lives, the lives of our children, we are going to defend ourselves. Not attack, but defend. By attacking us, you are going to see our faces, not our backs. War is a big distress, and it has a big price, in all meanings of this word. People lose their money, they lose their reputation, quality of life, freedom, and most importantly, people lose their loved ones. They lose themselves. A lot of things are always lacking in war, but what is in abundance is pain, dirt, blood, and death. Thousands, tens of thousands of deaths. You are told that Ukraine is a threat to Russia. This was not true before, not now, and won't ever be in the future. You are demanding security assurances from NATO. We are also demanding assurances of our security. The security of Ukraine from you, from Russia, and from other signatories of the Budapest Memorandum. Today, we are not part of random security alliances. The security of Ukraine is tied to the security of our neighbors. That is why we are now talking about the security of all Europe. But our main goal is peace in Ukraine and the safety of our citizens, of Ukrainians. We are determined to let everyone know about this, including you. War is going to deprive everyone of those assurances. No one will have any assurances of security. Who will suffer from this the most? The people. Who does not want this more than anything? The people. Who can prevent all of this from happening? The people. If people among you, I am sure that they are, public figures, journalists, musicians, actors, athletes, scientists, doctors, bloggers, comics, TikTokers and others, ordinary people, ordinary simple people, men, women, old, young, fathers, and most importantly, mothers, just as much as the people in Ukraine, no matter how much they try to convince you of the opposite. I know that my announcement will not be aired on Russian television, but the citizens of Russia have to see it. They need to know the truth, and the truth is that this needs to stop before it's too late. And if the authorities of Russia don't want to talk to us for the sake of peace, maybe they will talk to you. Do the people of Russia want war? I would have very much liked to be able to answer this, but the answer depends on you, the citizens of the Russian Federation. So, pretty good speech. And again, a stark contrast to kind of the hostile overtones of Putin. Putin's clearly pushed all his chips into the middle of the table and knows what he wants. Let's look at some of these accounts I would recommend, and I'll bring them up and you can go and follow them. If you're interested, obviously if you're not, no big deal. So this guy is a former cybersecurity expert and founded a company. His tweets are very good and informative. You can follow this guy, D. Alperovich. His stuff's been pretty righteous. If you look at his tweets, he's also currently at the moment sharing a lot of videos and a lot of media footage that's coming out at the moment. He's a good guy to follow. This guy's also good. Former Russia studies professor and essayist. Been covering Russia for a while. Kaufman Michael, Michael Kaufman, but it's Kaufman Michael on Twitter. He wrote an essay, which I think I've got here a while ago. It's pretty, here it is. Pretty interesting and accurately predicts kind of where we're at now. This was it, Russia's shock and awe. It was written a few days ago, and it's why he believes Moscow is going to use overwhelming force against the Ukraine, and points to other things here as to why he justifies it. It's a pretty good read. I mean, it's very in-depth, talking about all of the stuff we've just kind of shown you on this coverage. Definitely worth a read if you can go and get it. So, look, I got to get to these meetings. I'll probably fire up the stream after said meetings, and we'll go again, and I'll be able to go into more depth about US media coverage, because, as I said earlier, the media have already figured out who's to blame, and it's Trump. It was Trump the whole time, guys. So we'll have some fun picking that apart. But yeah, listen, if I know I got a lot of Russian followers and people that watch the stream, you know, I know that from the analytics. I know I've got a lot of Ukrainian followers. I know I got a Ukrainian regular, a very long time sub, and so obviously, listen, this is, you know, this is where all of this fucking nonsense, you know, impacts on us everyday folk, and so, you know, just be safe. Don't give in to the desire or the pressure to sort of hate people that really don't want anything to do with this either. And hopefully this is something that is an aberration rather than a prolonged conflict.